One of the worst disasters in the history of nuclear power.
A routine test at the Chernobyl nuclear plant went horribly wrong.
Almost 40 years after the fatal disaster, Chernobyl remains a radioactive wasteland. With recent grim news of Russian troops dying near the plant, we are sure that the Ukrainian site remains lethal, yet nature has its mysterious ways. In the absence of humans, Chernobyl has become a wildlife safe haven. The wild boars roaming in the area showed an unusually high amount of radioactivity, an issue that broke all scientific laws. Join us as we reveal why the Chernobyl accident failed to kill wild boars. Why Chernobyl is a scientific paradox. More than 38 years have passed since the Chernobyl disaster, an event widely acknowledged as the most catastrophic incident in the history of nuclear energy. This disaster was marked by a reactor explosion and fire that resulted in a massive release of radioactive materials into the environment. In the aftermath, over 350,000 people were evacuated from the exclusion zone. It is estimated that up to 50 individuals died from immediate effects related to the disaster. However, research indicates that as many as 4,000 additional fatalities may be linked to the long-term consequences of radiation exposure. Sadly, deaths continue to occur, and the region surrounding the Chernobyl nuclear power plant is unlikely to return to its pre-accident condition. There are reports that the area is very gradually coming back to life, but the process itself is going to take decades. The Chernobyl incident significantly transformed the surrounding ecosystem, impacting all forms of life, except for wild boars. These animals have remarkably thrived in an environment where radiation levels are still similar to those observed on the day of the disaster, seemingly unaffected by its dangers. You don't have to be an expert in physics to understand why this is a disturbing phenomenon. The disaster in 1986 released large amounts of cesium-137, a radioactive isotope with a half-life of slightly more than 30 years, into the environment. With the passage of over 3 decades since the incident, scientists anticipated that the levels of this isotope in contaminated regions would have diminished by at least 50%. This expectation proved accurate for many animal species, including deer, whose contamination levels have consistently decreased over the years. The reason for this decline is clear. Cesium gradually spread after the disaster, carried away by rain, absorbed by minerals, or moved deep into the soil, where it was no longer taken up by plants, and, subsequently, animals. Testing showed that most food samples from the exclusion zone contained not just half the original cesium concentration, but significantly lower amounts. These tests alone gave a lot of hope to the scientists. If Chernobyl had to gain its life back, the recovery of consumable food samples was an encouraging sign. The trouble began when researchers discovered that the radiation found in wild boar meat is so elevated that it is deemed unsafe for human consumption. This unexpected finding prompted scientists to classify the wild boars of Chernobyl as a scientific mystery. For years, many scientific ventures have held on to this question. Many theories came and went away, but today it seems like we might have figured out this paradox for good. You'll see why. What went down? If one is to understand the mystery of this scientific wonder, they'd have to start from the very beginning. The accident in Ukraine was a result of a flawed Soviet reactor designer, along with fatal mistakes made by the plant operations team. It was an open secret that the Soviet Union was hasty and desperate to build its nuclear capacities as a direct consequence of the Cold War. In doing so, it had ignored several safety protocols, which ended up becoming the crux of the crisis. It was well known that the Soviets didn't have an effective safety culture. With faulty engineering and little resources to go down with, many of its nuclear capacities were questionable. Yet Chernobyl was important. The workers on the reactor that blew up knew that they were living on the edge of a crisis, yet their complaints didn't exactly matter to the officials. From the coverage of the disaster to the investigation, many aspects of the accident reeked of sheer corruption and blatant lies. The catastrophic failure of reactor number 4 at Chernobyl resulted in the deaths of 30 operators and firefighters within 3 months, with several more fatalities occurring in the years that followed. One worker was killed instantly, while another succumbed shortly afterward in a hospital from injuries sustained. A third individual reportedly died from a coronary thrombosis at the scene. Initially, 237 individuals involved in the site's operations and cleanup efforts were suspected of having acute radiation syndrome, and 134 of these cases were later confirmed. Within a few weeks of the disaster, 28 individuals lost their lives due to the very same problem. Additionally, from 1987 to 2004, 19 more workers passed away, though radiation exposure cannot be conclusively identified as the cause in these cases, since the Soviet Union seemed to be more interested in covering their mistakes rather than helping the plant workers. The casualties continued. To this day, it is believed that we don't have the actual number of fatalities attributed to Chernobyl. Thankfully, there were no cases of acute radiation sickness among people residing off-site. However, it is widely believed that exposure to radioactive iodine fallout has contributed to a significant portion of thyroid cancer cases among children present at the time of the incident. Vast areas of Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, and beyond suffered varying levels of radioactive contamination. The Chernobyl disaster stands as a singular event in commercial nuclear power history, marking the only instance of fatalities directly related to radiation. Due to the reactor's unique design, the disaster's causes are largely irrelevant to the nuclear industry outside of the former Eastern Bloc. Regardless, the disaster became an impetus for the nation. The accident sparked profound changes in nuclear safety practices and fostered industry cooperation, particularly between Eastern and Western nations, before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Former President Mikhail Gorbachev later reflected that Chernobyl played an even greater role in the Soviet Union's collapse than his policy of perestroika, which had aimed at liberal reforms. Above everything else, the accident ultimately led to a scientific evolution in the Soviet Union that eventually helped what we know about radiology and the effects of a nuclear leak. In particular, the question of how radiation levels interact with a variety of animals became significantly easier once scientists began to study the wildlife of Chernobyl, or at least what was left of it. The day of the accident. The Chernobyl plant's vastness was indeed quite grand, which is why the destruction that followed was massive. The Chernobyl power complex, located roughly 130 kilometers north of Kiev, Ukraine, and about 20 kilometers south of the Belarusian border, was composed of 4 nuclear reactors designed in the RBM K1000 model. Units 1 and 2 were constructed between 1970 and 1977, followed by Units 3 and 4, which were completed by 1983. At the time of the disaster, 2 additional reactors were still under construction on the site. Positioned to the southeast of the complex, a man-made lake covering approximately 22 square kilometers was created alongside the Pripyat River, a tributary of the Dnieper, to supply cooling water for the reactors. This region of Ukraine, known for its Belarusian-style woodland, had a sparse population. Just 3 kilometers from the reactor stood the newly established city of Pripyat, home to 49,000 residents. Approximately 15 kilometers southeast of the plant lay the older town of Chernobyl, with a population of 12,500. Altogether, within a 30-kilometer radius of the power plant, the population ranged from 115,000 to 135,000 at the time of the incident. Seemingly, the scope of the accident couldn't have been much, yet the problem that incurred at reactor number 4 was a behemoth. On April 25, 1986, before a scheduled shutdown, Chernobyl Reactor 4's crew prepared for a test to measure how long its turbine could power the main circulation pumps after a loss of electricity. A similar test the previous year showed the turbine lost power too quickly, prompting a redesign of voltage regulators. Leading up to the test on April 26th, operators disabled automatic shutdown mechanisms, putting the reactor in an unstable state. When they attempted to shut down the reactor, a peculiarity in the control rods triggered a sudden power surge. This caused the hot fuel to react violently with cooling water, creating rapid steam and increasing pressure. The resulting overpressure partially detached the reactor's 1,000-ton cover plate, rupturing fuel channels and jamming control rods midway. The core flooded, generating more steam, leading to an explosion that released radioactive material into the atmosphere. 2 or 3 seconds later, a second explosion scattered fuel and burning graphite, likely due to hydrogen from zirconium steam reactions. The explosions immediately killed 2 workers and ignited fires that released significant radioactivity, totaling approximately 14 exabecquerels, with over half being biologically inert noble gases. Approximately a quarter of the reactor's 1,200 tons of graphite and its fuel were ejected, sparking several fires and releasing a significant amount of radioactive material into the environment. Following the Chernobyl accident, approximately 200 to 300 tons of water per hour was pumped into the intact portion of Reactor 4 using auxiliary feedwater pumps. However, this effort ceased after about 12 hours due to the risk of flooding adjacent Units 1 and 2. Between the 2nd and 10th day post-accident, an estimated 5,000 1,000 tons of boron, dolomite, sand, clay, and lead were airdropped onto the burning core by helicopter to control the fire and limit the spread of radioactive materials. A 1991 report from the State Committee on the Supervision of Safety in Industry and Nuclear Power examined the root cause of the disaster, extending beyond the crew's actions. While the report acknowledged that operators had put the reactor in an unstable and nearly inevitable accident-prone state, it also found that critical operating policies and safety principles necessary to prevent such a scenario had not been defined. More dangerously, operators had not been informed of the vital importance of maintaining a minimum reactivity margin or the specific risks tied to the reactor's specifications, which made low-power operation particularly lethal. What happened next was bleak and dark. The aftermath. The Chernobyl accident triggered the largest recorded release of radioactive material in any civilian context, with vast amounts of radioactive particles discharged into the air over a period of 10 days. This massive release led to severe social and economic upheaval for extensive populations in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. Two radionuclides, iodine-131 and cesium-137, were particularly impactful due to the radiation exposure they caused for the public. Estimates suggest that all xenon gas, around half of the iodine and cesium, and at least 5% of the remaining radioactive materials from Reactor 4's core, which held 192 tons of fuel, were released during the accident. Heavier particles settled close to the site as dust and debris, while lighter particles dispersed across Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, Scandinavia, and parts of Europe due to wind patterns. Among the casualties were firefighters who initially responded to fires on the roof of the turbine building. Though these fires were extinguished within hours, radiation exposure on the first day resulted in 28 fatalities, including 6 firefighters. By the end of July 1986, firefighters and plant workers received high radiation doses, sufficient to cause acute radiation syndrome, which occurs with short-term exposure to over 700 milligrays. The next priority was to clean up the radioactive contamination at Chernobyl, allowing the remaining 3 reactors to restart and enabling more permanent shielding for the damaged reactor. Approximately 200,000 people, known as liquidators, from across the Soviet Union took part in the recovery and cleanup efforts during 1986 and 1987. These workers faced significant radiation exposure, with average doses of around 100 millisieverts. Roughly 20,000 liquidators received doses of around 250 millisieverts, while a few were exposed to around 500 millisieverts. The number of liquidators eventually grew to over 600,000, though most of these received only low radiation doses. The highest exposure was endured by about 1,000 emergency responders and personnel on site during the accident's first day. In the years after the accident, an additional 220,000 people were resettled to less contaminated areas. The original 30-kilometer exclusion zone, spanning 2,800 square kilometers, was modified and extended to cover 4,300 square kilometers. This resettlement was based on a projected lifetime radiation dose criterion of 350 millisieverts. However, radiation levels in most of the affected area, excluding about half a square kilometer close to the reactor, dropped quickly, resulting in average doses less than 50% above the usual background level of 2.5 millisieverts per year. The images emerging from Chernobyl were spitting images of a ghost town. With no life around, the town was in ruins. Only the official teams working on cleaning the plant were to be seen around. Everywhere you looked, there was only destruction. However, 3 decades later, Chernobyl is coming back to life. Naturally, the abandoned plant has turned into a haven for Ukrainian wildlife. As the radiation in the town becomes less severe, more and more animals have been captured by the research teams. The new springing of life in Chernobyl was the key for scientists to solve the wild boar paradox, which had left them stunned for years. Chernobyl is coming back to life. In 2022, science writer Erin Kelly observed, large mammals thrive in the Red Forest. Chernobyl's animals have found an unexpected haven for wildlife in the Red Forest of the exclusion zone. Kelly's story followed a surge of articles celebrating a rise in the number of mammals spotted in the Chernobyl exclusion zone since its closure to humans. These reports were prompted by biologists' field camera footage showing large mammals not typically found in the zone, such as wolves and bears. While the supporting studies did not conduct detailed surveys on species populations emissions or track time spent within the contaminated area, the footage was used to promote an image of an ecosystem in recovery. Many articles claimed this as evidence that ecosystems could naturally recover from radiological contamination. Since human activity is very limited in the area, the wildlife has all the space and resources to thrive. Spanning an area comparable to Northumbria, the Chernobyl exclusion zone now hosts a wide range of habitats for wildlife, including pine and deciduous forests, grasslands, wetlands, rivers, lakes, and deserted towns. Yet questions remain: which animals thrive here, and does radiation influence which species are present? Cameras from the Royal Society of Biology have recorded an impressive variety of Europe's medium to large mammals within the zone. Species include the European badger, Eurasian beaver, elk, Eurasian lynx, grey wolf, raccoon dog, red deer, red fox, roe deer, and wild boar. Notably, these sightings include some firsts, such as photographic evidence of brown bears returning to the zone and the first documentation of European bison in the Ukrainian part of the zone. Existing studies and subsequent media reports on Chernobyl present a divided view. Some report significant declines in certain wildlife groups, including insects typically seen as resilient to radiation, while others suggest Chernobyl has become a refuge for wildlife. This ongoing lack of scientific consensus on the threshold below which radiation exposure would minimally impact populations creates challenges for regulating nuclear sites. Interestingly, as the wild boars made their way to the site, only then the scientists encountered the unusual problem. Why are the wild boars still so much more radioactive than other animals lurking in the abandoned plant? Plethora of theories. Even today, scientists are divided over the existence of wildlife in Chernobyl. Some researchers had speculated that cesium might dissolve more readily in the fat tissue of wild boars and remain there for longer. The hypothesis itself was pretty logical, but the fallibility of the theory fell short. Many research studies were conducted based on the fat tissue theory, but eventually it was thrown away from the table. Instead, it had become very clear that wild boars were somehow denying the laws of physics. Eventually, this also turned out to be false when researchers at the Vienna University of Technology and the Leibniz University of Hanover successfully solved the wild boar paradox. In a paper published in the journal Environmental Science and Technology in 2023, researchers explained that the high levels of radioactivity in wild boar meat are linked to nuclear weapons tests that occurred prior to the disaster, as well as the pig's preference for a specific type of truffle. Following the accident, people were advised against consuming local mushrooms and the meat of wild animals due to significant radioactive contamination. While the contamination levels in deer and roe deer decreased over time as anticipated, the radioactivity measured in wild boar meat remained surprisingly elevated, as reported by teams of scientists working in the area. To this day, certain samples of wild boar meat from populations that have dispersed throughout the region still exhibit radiation levels significantly above regulatory limits. Typically, radiation exposure in food diminishes more rapidly because the cesium has migrated significantly since the Chernobyl incident, washed away by rainwater or driven deep into the soil, thereby preventing absorption by plants and animals in the same initial quantities. Consequently, after one half-life, most food samples demonstrate far less than half of the original concentration, except for the exception of wild boars roaming around the abandoned plant. To unravel this mystery, a research team led by Professor Georg Steinhauser at the Technical University of Vienna aimed to determine both the origin and levels of radioactivity in wild boars. This is achievable because different sources of radioactive isotopes possess unique physical signatures, explains Dr. Bin Feng, who conducts his research at the Institute of Inorganic Chemistry at Leibniz University Hanover and the Trigger Center Atom Institute at the Technical University of Vienna. He further added, for instance, these sources release not only cesium-137 but also cesium-135, which has a significantly longer half-life. The ratio of these two cesium isotopes varies according to the specific nuclear event. A breakthrough in measuring cesium-135, which is considerably more challenging to detect, allowed the researchers to identify that the wild boars contained evidence of a different era, the nuclear weapons tests conducted during the 1960s. Yet, the wild boars of Chernobyl carry a piece of the Cold War within themselves even today. Back in the 60s, the top priority for the Soviets was to gain a nuclear edge over over its historical rival, the United States of America. In the process, the totalitarian regime of the country has sidelined every necessity of the nation, from food to safety protocols. Everyone around had one purpose: to become the mightiest nuclear weapon-possessing country in the world. As grim as it sounds, the Soviets were exposed to radiation years before the Chernobyl disaster shook the core of the regime. The answer to the wild boar paradox depicted the very same. The findings indicated that while approximately 90% of the cesium-137 found in Central Europe originates from the Chernobyl disaster, the percentage present in wild boar samples is much lower. Instead, a substantial portion of the cesium in wild boar meat can be traced back to nuclear weapons testing, up to 68% in certain samples. Yet this observation further confused the scientists. Why is this the case? The case of deer truffles. As the saying goes, you are what you eat. Researchers have attributed the presence of radiation from the era of nuclear weapons testing in wild boars to their diet. These animals have a particular fondness for deer truffles, mushrooms that grow underground and are unearthed by the boars. Remarkably, radioactive cesium accumulates in these subterranean mushrooms with a considerable time delay. According to Georg Steinhauser, this is because the cesium migrates downwards through the soil very slowly, sometimes only about 1 millimeter per year, as reported by Sci Daily. Since deer truffles are found at depths of 20 to 40 centimeters, they are currently absorbing cesium released during the Chernobyl disaster. In contrast, the cesium from older nuclear weapons tests has already reached these depths some time ago. These mushrooms, which resemble marzipan balls rolled in cinnamon, have consequently experienced a dual exposure to cesium, which also decays over time. Steinhauser further explains, when you consider all these factors, it becomes clear why the radioactivity of deer truffles and subsequently of pigs remains relatively stable over the years. He adds, our research highlights how complex the interrelationships in natural ecosystems can be, but it also demonstrates that with sufficiently accurate measurements, answers to such mysteries can be discovered. Given these conditions, the contamination levels in wild boar meat are not anticipated to decrease significantly in the coming years. This situation could pose challenges for farmers. In some regions, wild boars are hunted less frequently, possibly due to their lingering radioactivity, making them less desirable. Not to mention, their overpopulation often leads to damage to agriculture and forestry. As per the scientists, the best way to tackle the problem of over-radiation in the area is to let nature take its course. In the absence of human activity in the area, wildlife found new avenues to procreate life in the abandoned plant. As the animals brought nutrients and minerals to Chernobyl through their food or feces, research teams witnessed something remarkable. Surrounding the wildlife, plants are growing in all directions. This alone has given a decent surge to animal activity in Chernobyl. Excitingly, the biologist has documented several protected bird species, including the black stork, golden eagle, and white-tailed eagle. This finding highlights the remarkable diversity of wildlife thriving in this radioactive landscape. While image analysis is still underway, it is already evident that many animal species are prevalent across all areas, regardless of radiation levels. This research holds significant value as it provides robust and independently verifiable data regarding the impact of radiation on wild populations. Current scientific literature concerning Chernobyl, along with subsequent media coverage, presents conflicting narratives. Some reports indicate substantial declines in wildlife populations, such as insects, which are generally considered to be relatively resistant to radiation. In contrast, other studies suggest that Chernobyl has evolved into a wildlife sanctuary. This ongoing lack of scientific consensus regarding the radiation exposure levels below which populations are unlikely to experience significant harm complicates the regulation of nuclear facilities. Overall, scientists are optimistic though. However, the recent escalation between Russia and Ukraine has compromised the sanctity of wildlife that had found a new home in Chernobyl. As the reports of the Russian military taking control of the radioactive plant hit the news, it is glaringly obvious that Chernobyl has a long way to go. The hub of employment. When the Soviet regime announced the job openings to clean the plant in 1986, they got a bigger response than they had anticipated. The country was in ruin. Many young individuals were desperate for jobs, even if they came at the expense of their life. Around the nuclear power plant, certain jobs were perilously dangerous, such as lifting highly radioactive debris or pouring concrete to seal the reactor. These tasks posed the risk of workers absorbing lethal doses of radiation within just a few minutes. Estimates regarding the number of liquidators and the workers workers involved in the cleanup and containment efforts vary significantly due to the absence of an official registry for all participants. However, it is believed that the total number ranges in the hundreds of thousands, potentially exceeding 500,000 individuals. These workers hailed from various regions of the former Soviet Union, and most were young men at the time of the disaster. Today, it is estimated that only about 10% of them are still alive. As unsettling as it sounds, alongside the wildlife, there's a minority of people who are also photographed near the plant. Of the approximately 7,000 individuals who regularly enter and exit the Chernobyl exclusion zone for work, more than 4,000 operate on shifts designed to limit their exposure to ionizing radiation. These individuals either work 15 days a month or 4 days a week. These workers include security guards, firefighters, scientists, and those responsible for maintaining the infrastructure of this unique community. Since Chernobyl serves as their part-time residence rather than a permanent home, they occupy some of the rooms and apartments that were evacuated in 1986. In the evenings, life tends to be quite peaceful. Many choose to read or watch movies. On particularly hot days, some may break radiation safety regulations by taking a swim in the nearby river. As the animals around them are losing their radioactivity, such individuals are hopeful that Chernobyl will be full of life again. Yet scientists are constantly telling us otherwise. It is just deeply unfortunate that their fears have been confirmed as well. What's happening in Chernobyl today? In the early stages of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Reuters reported alarming information regarding Russian soldiers who occupied the site of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. These soldiers maneuvered their armored vehicles without radiation protection through the highly toxic area known as the Red Forest, stirring up clouds of radioactive dust. The consequences for the wildlife in this region were immediate and severe. The Independent highlighted that Russian soldiers stationed in the forest began experiencing symptoms of radiation sickness, which can manifest within an hour of exposure and may persist for several months, often leading to fatal outcomes, as confirmed by diplomats. Other emerging reports rapidly built upon this narrative. The Telegraph indicated that radiation from the devastated Chernobyl nuclear plant had reportedly caused the death of a Russian soldier whose unit camped in the toxic Red Forest. The British Metro detailed how Russian troops withdrawn from the Chernobyl site were being urgently transported across the border to a specialized medical facility in Belarus due to acute radiation sickness. According to the Daily Beast, journalists on the scene described ghost buses carrying deceased soldiers from Belarus to Russia under the cover of night. Due to the ongoing conflict, these claims remain unverified. However, it is unlikely that the soldiers' exposure would result in a large number of immediate fatalities. Instead, such exposure is more likely to initiate cancers that may develop over time. Despite the starkly different narratives surrounding humans and non-human animals, their behaviors were strikingly similar. Both groups interacted with the contaminated soil of the Red Forest, with animals feeding on the plants and other creatures in the area. For non-human animals, this behavior illustrated nature's resilience and healing capabilities, while for humans, the situation appeared catastrophic. The tragic passing of Russian soldiers is just another terrifying reminder for us. Like wild boars of Chernobyl, humans are still living through the consequences of a dictatorship that once thrived. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.